When I was 5 years old, I walked to school all by myself. On the first day of kindergarten, I walked out my front door, stepped onto the sidewalk with my mom and my little brothers, and I headed down the sidewalk. We turned at Lisa's house, right next to the telephone pole where after a few phonics lessons, I would learn my first very bad word. We crossed the busy street, headed up a block past Ingrid's daycare, took a left, another left, and there we were at Elsa Meyer Elementary School. On my second day of school, my mom kissed me goodbye one corner earlier, and each day I walked just a little bit further on my own until by the end of the first week of school, I was walking to school by myself. I have really fun memories of this time. They were social memories, everything from marveling that my best friend already knew how to spell elevator, to trying to talk Ricky, who is known for eating worms, into eating another worm. But the only really remarkable thing about this was how very unremarkable it was at the time. Almost everyone I knew walked to school. So for the past 15 years, I've been collecting stories about how we experience our communities, considering how we get around them and seeking to understand how the way we organize ourselves affect our daily lives. And what I've found again and again is that places that are made primarily for people work better than places made primarily for cars. Even a small pivot toward people-friendly transportation could have a tremendous impact on our community. Even Ford Motor Company CEO Mark Fields recently said, "The way that our transportation system that has worked so well for us for the past 100 years isn't going to cut it anymore, especially in our urban areas." So let's take a look at where we've been and then dwell for a minute on where we actually are before we see what we might have in the city of the future. So 200 years ago, our streets were the same way our streets always had been. They were places for people. They were marketplaces. They were playgrounds. And yes, they were also thoroughfares. Now, 150 years ago or so, we added streetcars to that mix. Now, streetcars are on rails, so they're predictable. It changed our streets a little bit, but the fundamental way the streets worked stayed the same. And then, the motor car. This was a disruptive technology, as we've heard before, and this is what streets looked like when the car came on the scene. As you might imagine by looking at that picture, initially there was a tremendous amount of resistance to cars even being present in a place that had traditionally belonged to everyone. Cars were seen as violent invaders of the streets and drivers as reckless hooligans. The antipathy became so great that in 1923, a group of concerned citizens from Cincinnati put together a referendum insisting that cars on their streets would have governors limiting their speed to 23 miles per hour. Now, the early motor car companies and their allies saw this threat for what it was. They knew that their customers liked to go fast. That was why they had a car. But, so they threw all their resources at first defeating this referendum, and then, taking their strategy a little bit further, they started a campaign to claim the street for the car. Now, the PR part of their campaign focused on the people who were present in the streets and on painting them as kind of backwards, hapless country bumpkins. They had a name for people like that back then. They called them Jays. And so the jaywalker was born. And the term and the fundamental change to the way that we use our streets remains with us today. Now, what our forebears could not have foreseen was that by helping ourselves to get to places further away and faster in our cars, which seems like a great thing, we would paradoxically limit the number of places we're able to get without our cars. We kind of inadvertently leapt into this unprecedented experiment to have, rather than driving be one good means of transportation, to have it be our only viable means of transportation. There was a social critic, Ivan Illich, who summed this up well when he said, "Beyond a certain speed, motor vehicles create remoteness which only they can shrink. They create distances for many and shrink them for only a few." And this isn't without consequence. A few years ago, I worked at our local public transportation agency, Max Transit, where I interacted with people who dwelt within this paradox every day. One memorable person was a gentleman who bounded into our office one day. This was clearly the best day of his life. He had just landed an amazing new job right outside town, and he was in my office to buy a monthly bus pass. But as we talked through his job, and as we talked through his starting time, we realized that he started work too early for the regular route bus to get him there. He needed a special reserved ride that cost a lot more, and it was beyond his ability to afford. And he deflated in front of me as he realized that this desperately wanted job was not something he had a way to get to. From where he stood that day, there may as well have been a physical chasm separating him and his new employer. And this isn't just an issue for people who are trying to get out of poverty. Another person that comes to mind is a woman who lived out towards the lakeshore. Her husband had just had a knee replacement, and then she broke her leg and was no longer able to drive. She was beside herself on the phone, trying to figure out how they were going to get groceries, how they were going to get to their doctor appointments. She realized that without her ability to drive, they were little more than prisoners in their own home. In contrast, a couple weeks ago, I returned from a trip to Japan, and their transportation system is a little bit different than ours. Now, it has all the same components as ours does. There are cars on almost every street. There are bikes, there are buses, there are people walking. There is the bullet train, which we do not have, and we wish for every winter when we're on 131 driving down to Chicago, don't we? Or 31. At any rate, just the different allocation of these different transportation resources makes people experience their community differently. And where I really noticed this was in seeing how the really elderly people get around their streets. And I'm talking about probably people in the range of 80 to 100. You might know that Japan has some of the highest rates of centenarians in the world. So this is very unlike what we see in Holland, where it's the Freedom Village bus goes to Meyer once or twice a week. As good as that is, the people in Japan, as they age, are still able to remain integrated fully into their communities. And they're able to maintain relationships that they've had for years. They're able to stay in their own homes because they don't need to drive in order to engage with their communities. And that's important to all of us, right? It matters that we're able to maintain relationships, that we're able to earn a living, that we're able to make our own decisions about when we're going to get groceries and when we're going to go to the coffee shop. This is something that's important to all of us. So let's take a look at what some people-friendly cities do in order to understand what we might do better in our own community. So first of all, people-friendly cities invest in many different types of transportation. Now, this transportation mix needs to hit a few high points. So it needs to be affordable to the government that most often is the one who builds and maintains it, as well as to the average citizen who needs to use it. It needs to be accessible to people of all ages and all abilities. And it needs to maintain our air quality and our quality of life. Now, there does need to be a mix here. All modern cities include cars, but they also include sidewalks with robust crosswalks. They include bikeways, and they include public transportation. Second, people-friendly cities prioritize safety above everything else, most especially speed. After several years in decline, our traffic fatality rate spiked to 12.8 per 100,000 in 2015. Now, I don't know if 12 sounds like a big number to you, but multiplied out over the course of an average American lifespan, That means that 1 in every 100 of us will be killed in a traffic crash. And this is largely unnecessary. In 1997, Sweden rolled out their Vision Zero initiative. The goal of Vision Zero is 0 traffic deaths, and the fundamental premise is this: death is not an acceptable price to pay for transportation. The corollary to it is that people make mistakes. Sometimes people make really dumb mistakes, and our transportation system should be set up to absorb those mistakes. Look, we hope that people stop tomorrow driving down the street like this and thinking they're just fine, but just in case they don't, maybe we should try to keep them from killing anybody on the way home from work. So there were a couple different areas where they really addressed this. They found that the greatest challenges to safety were in speed differentials and in mass differentials. So they've lowered some speed limits. They've done a lot of separating uses so that larger and smaller vehicles aren't quite so close together, things like that. And of course, every policy comes down to the local level, to people's everyday lives. So a friend of mine in Sweden, that's her daughter up there in the corner, told me how this has played out in their community. Around every school and park, they have closed the streets to automobile traffic entirely. It's open to bikes, it's open to people who are walking, but no cars on those streets. And that's allowed the kids to get to and from school, to practice that age-appropriate independence, and to do that safely and on their own. Now, imagine just for a second what that would look like in our own community. Think of a school that you know, and imagine what that would look like. And then stop and take half a step back and just observe without judgment for a second what your response was to that image. This is a really radical concept in our context. Since 1997, when Vision Zero was unfurled in Sweden, they have reduced their traffic fatality rate to just 3 per 100,000, in comparison to our 12.8. They're saving 3 out of every 4 of the lives that we lose each year. Now, the third thing that people-friendly cities do is they have citizens and leaders who are willing to make change. Now, it might be difficult to believe now, but in the 1970s, Dutch streets looked much like ours do today. They, too, had bought into the automobile experiment hook, line, and sinker. They had even gone so far as to demolish homes in order to widen streets, just like we had. But in the 1970s, some people began to be concerned in neighborhoods because they were seeing too many of their neighbors killed in traffic crashes. There was a special problem with children who were being killed on the streets. So a group of people got together and they started a campaign called Stop the Child Murder. They weren't mincing words. After many years of effort, they prevailed. And bit by bit, they began to transform their communities so that their streets are more people-friendly again. Dutch cities now set the standard for what a livable community looks like around the world. So what is next? You've heard it said several times before here that we live in an age of disruption. We know that our streets are going to change. We know that our transportation system is going to change. And what that looks like in the next 20 years, how we live in our communities, the freedom that we have 10, 20, 30 years down the road, depends on the decisions that we make now, that we make today. So I invite you to join me in creating a more livable community. Every one of us has a role to play. And so I ask you today to consider if you might choose your one thing. Maybe you'll ride your bike to work one day a week. Maybe you'll start a Safe Routes to School program at your child's school. Maybe you'll put a covered bike rack outside your business, or maybe you'll sponsor a team for Green Commute Week. Whatever our future is going to be, it's going to be something that we create together out of our small actions day to day. I hope you'll join me. Thank you.